It takes a second. Yes, and we are live now. So, if it's your first time here with us, this is in this channel. This channel is called Language Learning Lives. It is a series of line interviews with great researchers who are somehow interested in the development of language learners and teachers' lives. And today, I have the honor to talk to Diane Larsen-Freeman. So how are you, Dr. Larsen-Freeman, and how are things where you live?
Yeah, well, as you can imagine, and as in many parts of the world, things are abnormal, shall we say, not normal, kind of crazy. We are under orders to shelter at home, and so that's what we're trying to do to the best of our ability, going only out for necessary trips to get groceries or to go to the pharmacy if necessary. We're lucky because we have a son in town, and he and his wife have kept us well stocked. We go out occasionally, that's all. But of course, beyond the personal inconvenience, there's a great deal of sadness about people's getting sick and loss of lives, um, and the uncertainty of it all. I mean, that's also having great effect on people's morals and their emotions, the uncertainty of all, and how it all came upon us so suddenly. When you first asked me if I wanted to do this, it was a while ago, and things were not quite at what they say, the epicenter or the peak then. And I thought it was a sort of odd time, in a way, to talk about professional issues when there was so much other travail going around the world. But you convinced me that you wanted to use your time well to connect people. And indeed, it seems perhaps more now than ever that the connections are
Yeah,
important.
and, and I was talking to Dr. Gerald Murray earlier this day, and I was talking to him that things are so intense now that I think we won't be the same after this. And so I think I'm sure there are a lot of people watching us now, and I'm sure they will benefit from your uh, speech here today. I'm sure you have a lot to say. So let me introduce our very special guest. Dr. Larsen-Freeman is Professor Emerita at SIT Graduate Institute, where she was on faculty from 1978 to 2002. She holds a PhD in linguistics from the University of Michigan, where she is also Professor Emerita. Currently, she's a visiting senior fellow at the University of Pennsylvania. She's been a teacher educator for more than 30 years. Dr. Larsen-Freeman has also published numerous books and articles about second language acquisition research, English grammar, and language teaching methods. Her work on the complex dynamic systems approach to second language development is very well known and important in our field. Is that all correct?
It's very generous.
Yes, it's true. So, thank you so much for believing in this project and accepting to participate right away. I know that there are very excited people watching us right now. And when I was reading about your life, uh, I saw that you were a Peace Corps volunteer teaching English in Malaysia from 1967 to 1969. And according to the Wikipedia, it's an experience that you credit for igniting your fascination with language acquisition. So, could you talk more about this experience and how it influenced your professional life?
Yeah, it's good to see you did your homework, Fernando.
Yes.
Yes. I Yeah, so I joined the Peace Corps right out of the university. I was inspired in those days by John F. Kennedy's call to service. And I had a sense of wanting to have a bit of an adventure and explore the world. But during my undergraduate days, I majored in psychology because I was interested in theories of learning.
Hmm.
It wasn't until I went over to Malaysia that I found language and became interested in theories of language learning, or not theories in those days, just questions about language learning. I had studied Spanish, so I assumed the invitation from the government would send me somewhere to a Spanish speaking country. But the government, in all its wisdom, did not do that. It sent me around the world to Malaysia, to Sabah, to Borneo, on the other side of the world from me. And to tell you the truth, I had only been on an airplane once before. I mean, one didn't travel so frequently by air in the early 1960s. So it was a completely different experience. And language became interesting to me, not only because of its learning, but also because it was part of my lived
Hmm.
experience. I mean, I was learning Malay or Bahasa Indonesia, which is very close, Bahasa Melayu, at the same time that I was teaching English. So it was kind of around me. I was swimming in it, language. And of course, the whole experience of being in another culture, in another country, with other people, had a transformative effect on me. And then, on top of that, there was the bond that I came to forge with my students that was so important. And just a footnote on that experience. Last summer, the summer of 2019, you'll note that's 50 years since I left Malaysia. I
Yes,
left in 69.
that's accurate.
And 50 years later, last summer, I went back for the first time
Wow.
to Borneo, to Tawau, my town. Before I went, I was able to establish contact with one of my former students. I had maintained contact for, oh, I don't know, maybe 25 or 30 years with some of them. But after the years pass, that contact dwindles and diminishes and eventually stops. But I had contact with one of my students. That's an interesting experience in itself. But anyway, I don't want to spend all the time talking about 1969. I told the student that I was probably going to be able to come to Tawau. That was the town in Borneo that I taught and lived in. I was speaking at a conference in Malacca in West Malaysia, and I flew over to East Malaysia. The student, in the meantime, had rallied my former students, and a delegation met me at the airport in Tawau, brought me to my hotel, and took me out to dinner, where 60 of my former students were there to greet me.
Wow.
And for the next days, we had a wonderful reunion. Of course, a lot of them were high school students, so they weren't that much younger than I. But of course, none of us looked the same. And so there was a lot of trying to figure out who everybody was. But it almost didn't matter. It was just a wonderful feeling to be reunited after such a long time. And I think that's part of teaching, too, is that bond that you create with your students that never really goes away.
Yes, I have a professor, a very important one, and she once told me that to teach is to touch a life forever. So,
Mm.
uh,
And to be touched,
yes,
because it was certainly a reciprocal, joyful occasion. Now they want me to come back for their 50th anniversary of graduation in a few years, a couple of years, but I'm not sure. We'll see.
yeah.
We'll see what
So,
the world brings.
what a wonderful story. Yeah. So
Mm.
I did my homework. So, uh, so your book, Techniques and Principles in Language Teaching, it was first published in 1986, and it has been re-edited three times. Am I correct?
Released, republished three
Republished.
times.
Yeah,
I wrote it. I did.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, but
Yes,
in the third
that's correct.
edition, there are some new chapters on task-based learning, political dimensions of language teaching, and the emerging uses of technology in language teaching and learning. So, would you add new chapters if there were a fourth edition of this book.
Oh, Ronaldo. Ronaldo, I just told you how old I was. I hinted at how old I was. I don't know if there'll be a fourth edition. Marty Anderson helped me with the third. She did the chapter on technology, so maybe she would take over for a fourth. But let me say
Hmm.
this. Uh, Many people say, or some people say, some of my colleagues say, we are beyond methods. We're in a post-methods condition or era. And I don't think that's, well, I don't know if it's not correct, but I don't believe it, let's put it that way. Because no one wants to impose methods. No one wants to suggest that they be practiced in a lockstep fashion. I have confidence in teachers that they'll adjust and adapt methods to their own context. But it seems to me methods are really valuable in helping um, provide models of ideas or principles, I call them, and connect them with activities or techniques. That's the techniques and principles in the title. Coherent. They're coherent. They have a sense of whole. And those are great models, especially for novice teachers to want to say, well, what do I do? But it's a model also for more experienced teachers to create their own method. That same idea of combining principles or thoughts or ideas or beliefs with activities, techniques, and lessons. So it seems to me that really is still important. Besides, methods introduce new techniques and they add to our repertoires. And I think the, the fuller our toolbox, the better off we are. So if I were to do a fourth edition, I wouldn't take out anything. I wouldn't subtract anything. I think the methods that are there still give us that full view, or as full a possible view, of what is available, and not to choose among them, but to forge one's own way by reading about them, learning them, trying them out, experimenting, and then creating one's own approach. But you're asking me what new chapters I would add. I certainly would revisit the one on technology, because at the time, I think we saw technology as a complement, adding something to language teaching, something that students would take advantage of themselves. Um, I'm looking at my notes. Providing resources. Of course, technology has always been present in language teaching. Even a blackboard or a whiteboard is a tool, right? But the technology we're talking about, computer assisted language learning, or the use of the World Wide Web, or the use of social media, all of that certainly provided new resources. It allowed for people to access the language more than before, perhaps. It allowed them to, as James G. says, connect with affinity groups, groups who share an interest. It allows the recording of language so that you can read a transcript or read the written word and provide reflection on it afterwards. So all these are important resources that technology brings. But I've been asking myself for a long time, has it really transformed learning? Is it about more, or is it about different? And I'm now thinking, and probably others have thought this for a while, that it actually is altering, in a way, what we do. It's not just a question of supplementing or complementing the classroom, although I think teachers are always going to be necessary as mediators, but or at least desirable as mediators. I don't know if they're necessary. There's always been autodidacts. But I think that it's actually transformed, or has the potential to transform, what we do. I mean, witness what's going on right now.
Yeah.
In my state, the governor has dictated that all schools must close for the rest of the year. Our schools go through the mid-June, so there are no classes now. The schools are locked. The playgrounds are locked. So teachers are scrambling to figure out how to deliver content online if they haven't done it before. And there are a lot of crash courses to help support them. There's a flood of material on the internet. But what's going to happen when the crisis passes? I guess we're going to not go back to what we always did. We'll still have face-to-face instruction, but I think people will much more take advantage of technology.
Yeah.
Technology, I think, gives our students new forms of discourse, new forms of authorship. Authorship. Think about Wikipedia, for example, that so many people rely on, and yet the authors of the entries in Wikipedia are not experts, right? It's a bottoms-up creation where many people contribute to it. There's no editor that decides. I mean, no single editor that decides something belongs or doesn't belong. There's a team of them. It gives us new ways to participate in communities. It allows for greater individualization because people have the ability to focus or to follow their own paths. And it seems to me that all of that contributes importantly to our understanding of language and the reshaping of language, and how by participating in these communities of practice, in the discourse, we're actually changing language as we use it. So I think it's important to revisit the technology and give it its due, suggesting that it's more than just enhancing, it's actually transforming. A second area, although I don't know if I would make it a full chapter, but a second area that has been talked about, at least in my country, elsewhere too, because I was just in Cambodia, and I was in Vietnam on the same trip, not just, it was before the pandemic came to those countries, although that's a story in itself. But anyway, a lot of talk was on the skills for the 21st century, the idea that we should be teaching critical thinking, we should be teaching problem solving, we should be teaching, teaching, people have to learn collaboration. And it seems to me language teaching professionals are in the best position, or a good position, to work on those particular skills. So the 21st century skills might be another area, a theme anyway. I don't know if it would warrant a chapter. But, it seems to me that the 21st century skills and the rapidly changing world that we're all experiencing, even before the pandemic, certainly it seems to be that way. We have to create conditions where our students will learn to create and recreate themselves, because it seems that no one, or very few, will have a profession or a sense of well-being if they aren't able to change over the course of their lifetimes in order to deal with the changing world around them. And in order to do that, they have to learn how to learn. And so I've been talking recently about learning-centered teaching. We have teacher-centered teaching. That's not so bad. It's the wisdom of the professional right there that can inform the teaching and learning. We have replaced that. Some have, I would say, added to it by talking about learner-centered teaching, where we teach to the whole person. We understand our students as individuals. We try to accommodate their individual personalities, desires, goals. But how about learning-centered teaching? That's not a new concept, but it's perhaps one that we really should focus on more, because our students are going to have to continue to learn. And although we are naturally learning beings, there are ways that we can help them with our subject matter figure out how to learn language. Again, many do it on their own, but it seems to me that our job as teachers is to accelerate that, to facilitate that process. Henry Woodison just wrote recently, last year, learning should determine what is taught rather than the reverse. And so I think a learning-centered teacher creates a learning environment that offers affordances to all students. See, I don't believe learning takes place in a closed circuit of input-output. I believe there's a contextualized dynamic to the language learning classroom where students do or do not seize the affordances that are made available, and where teachers do or do not help to make those affordances available to all students. And I think the learning-centered teaching is going to be really important. I should have also noted, because I just reminded myself when I said all students, that one of the issues in technology, of course, is accessibility. Mm-hmm. And we have to remember that not everyone has the advantage I have, and apparently you as well, of having a computer, having a wideband internet access, and lots of resources to support my use of a computer. And so, another concern, but certainly one that we should articulate, is to create technology or support technology enhanced teaching by use of smartphones, for example, mobile phones, which many have around the world, or at least to be cognizant of the fact that not everyone can participate in the same way.
Yeah.
I always you need to. It's my tendency, in case you haven't noticed, to go on and on. But you sent me the questions in advance, and so I had a chance to think about them. If I'm going on too much, just cut me
No,
off,
you
okay?
are those topics that you were mentioning, and I mean they are emerging topics and very contemporary ones because the situation that we're living now, teachers, the situation they find they they need to find opportunities to recreate, as you said, recreate themselves and reinvent themselves, and that's happening through digital technology. And I agree with you that the 21st century skills they need to be more addressed by us, and especially collaboration, because nowadays, with this crisis that we're living, we see that collaboration is being a key for those teachers that can find solutions for their problems. And I mean, I totally agree with what you said. And
Yeah, and you are a technician. You are somebody very well informed by technology, and I have a lot of confidence in your youth and people like you to actually help us with this next step, which some are claiming is a new revolution.
yeah, and
The knowledge creating. I should have added that too. The idea of knowledge being created, as opposed to just looked up. Right? I've hinted at
yeah.
that with the Wikipedia, but I think that's also going to be a theme that's going to run through technology, knowledge creation.
Yes, I was talking about that with uh, Dr. Richard Smith also, that it's an opportunity for the situation that we're living now. It's an opportunity for encouraging students to create and to experiment and to develop knowledge as opposed to just receiving content. Uh,
That's right. That's right. And that's exciting.
Yes, totally. But as you were speaking, I was thinking here about this situation that about access, because we sometimes think that everybody has access to digital technology, but it's not like that. And I'm here trying to imagine how those people who doesn't have access to computers, and those teachers who doesn't have access to computers, how are they doing? So it
Yeah.
is something that we need to think.
And I'm going to tell you something. I mean, that's certainly important, and I'm glad we had a chance to mention that. But we often think about that in terms of developing country. That I'm sitting in the state of Vermont, which is in the northeast of the United States. It's very rural. There are only 500,000, has mountains. And guess what? There are school districts, there are homes here that do not have access, not wideband access to the internet. Isn't that interesting? So teachers now on lockdown are trying to reach their students, and not all their students can be reached. So it's a widespread problem. Certainly in a rich country like ours, it's not as much of a problem as, say, others, but there is an issue of accessibility that
Yeah.
affects many.
And other things, other situations, for example, environmental situations. For example, here in Australia, I was talking to Dr. Alice Chick, my supervisor here, and she was mentioning that sometimes here in Sydney, I mean, a very big and cosmopolitan city, sometimes I mean, the power is out for a week because of a huge storm or because of uh, other phenomena. So it's also something. I mean, many and different. variables.
Yes.
Okay, so I think you might have answered this question millions of times. But since it's an opportunity I have to ask you, I will ask you this again. So, how thinking about foreign language learning or foreign language development as a complex dynamic system can help teachers in their daily practices?
Yes. Well, this is the million and first question. Right. You're right. I get million and one, I guess I should say. I do get asked that question. Let me just say, as a preliminary, that I got excited about these ideas a long but I realized that I needed to put them out to have other people take them up, those that wanted to, and to take them forth. That is, it doesn't happen within one person's mind. Consequently, I have learned now from other people, conversation partners, co-authors, people who've read what I've written and asked me questions. I've learned a lot from them, but my point is that this is not me telling you what to do. These are some ruminations that I've had, and I invite anybody to answer that question. It's an important question. I have an advantage because, oh yeah, I'm an author and I guess I'm a researcher, but I'm also a teacher. And sometimes I think new thoughts, or I entertain new kind of a teacher. So I've asked myself that question. I didn't need to have other people ask me. So how does this change what you do in the classroom? How does it change what you do as a researcher? I've also written and thought about that. I actually, now that I have this view of the world as a complex dynamic system, it's given me a whole new way of looking. And it's hard to help others appreciate that if they haven't yet involved themselves in complex dynamic. But it is a way of thinking. It's not a method. But it is a way of thinking that can inform what one does. I would not want to eliminate, certainly, or limit anything that one does in the classroom because it is a complex system. And teachers will need all the tools in their toolbox, as I said before, an expanding repertoire is what methods give you. But it's not a question of techniques at the abstract. They are there. It's a question of marrying those, fitting them to the context of the particular group of students at that particular time. It's a theory that can be abstract. I call it a meta theory. But its import is how it relates in that moment, in that particular contextualized moment. What is the best path forward? And we always ask that as teachers. That's not revelatory. That's not new. But I think having the ideas can help inform those local decisions that teachers make. So what are the ideas? I mean, one, it almost seems foolish to even say this now, but it wasn't always so well known or well experienced, is the interconnectedness of all things, all of us. So certainly that's there. I'll leave that one aside for now. But the dynamism of the system is very important. The idea in complex dynamic systems is that language emerges bottom up through interaction, through social interaction. So it's not a question of rules being posed from the bottom. It's a question of forms emerging through interaction. And of course, once there's a stability of those forms, they can, in fact, constrain the new forms that emerge. So it doesn't just keep spiraling out and becoming. What does it mean to say language is dynamic? Well, you may know, you may not know that I coined the term grammaring, Grammaring. And I actually added the ing for 4 or 5 different reasons. But one of them is because the ing in English conveys a process. And I had been concerned for some time about what Alfred North Whitehead calls the inert knowledge problem. The idea that we teach whatever we teach in our classes, but that can't be that is not available to our students outside of the classroom when they go to use it for their own purposes, or indeed when they return to our classes. What we thought they had learned is not necessarily. So I thought, what a waste of time. Why can't we teach language in a more dynamic fashion to match what it is, with the idea that it'll be more accessible? And so, of course, I use it with grammar because that's one of my interests. Grammaring, therefore, is the ability to use language or to use structures or constructions accurately, meaningfully, and appropriately. I could go on, and I do sometimes about that, but language is a dynamic system. And if we can teach it that way, we might be able to at least ameliorate the inert knowledge problem. I think learning takes place through co-adaptation. That is, both parties have to adapt to each other in order to adapt their language resources. So, how can we help our students learn to adapt, to mold what they know to a changing situation? Now, many teachers will use a role play, and by taking on another role, adapt language. You adapt language to the person in the role play. But I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about how to teach adaptation. We do it all the time. You and I are doing it right now. We're adapting our language resources to this particular Skype interview. So, because I don't talk like this at home all the time, but I changed the way I talk to some extent because of the formality of the situation, even though I'm sitting in my home. So how do we teach students to adapt? I use this example all the time, but it's simple and I can do it rapidly. There's a technique called the 4-3-2 technique. So you ask students to talk with a partner for 4 minutes about a topic of their choice. They change partners and talk for 3 minutes, the same topic, the same story. Change and have 2 minutes, same topic, same story, different partner. And the idea is they have to adapt their language resources. If they want to tell their full story, they have to be able to do it with fluency, but also from research we see with greater accuracy, perhaps because the ideas are more rehearsed. So that would be an example of helping students to learn to adapt by changing the speed with which they have to do something. I've also talked about iteration. We think of language learning taking place through repetition, but repetition suggests an exact sameness. I'm talking about iteration, which means coming back to the same, cluster of language or topic again and again. It's not recycling. And I have to go like this. I don't know how else, then again, to similar terrain or territory. You think about children, young children. I have grandchildren, and they always want me to read, and their parents, to read the same book over and over again. They've memorized it. I mean, if you say rather than the, they correct you, right? They know the words, but they want that over and over again. So I say to myself, why is that? Why is it that they want that to be read over and over again to them? And I've thought about that. I'll talk about that some other time, perhaps. But I think we can take a clue from that because they are learning language, aren't they? And so I thought, well, we don't want necessarily our students to bring in their favorite fairy tale, but they could bring in a passage of something that they were interested in. They could bring it to class. They could read it aloud. We could ask them to read it slowly. We could ask them to read it angrily. We could ask them to read it humorously, changing the conditions a little bit, the adaptation part, but also creating the iteration without boring them. I mean, we have to have new things. And I think iteration is important, not necessarily repetition. I know as a language learner, I like to have not just one. Recognizing and respecting the nonlinearity of the process. The nonlinearity, there'll be times when students seem to have learned something. I just said that, and you come back on Monday and it's not there. That's natural. It's a very natural characteristic. We shouldn't feel that they have failed or we have failed. And other times, you have a hard problem. You just give a little bit of instruction maybe, or they have a little bit of practice. Practice is really important. And they get it right away. there's a nonlinearity to the process. Perhaps the teacher from the previous year was very instrumental in laying the groundwork, and so all you have to do is just a little polishing, a little finishing, and they seem to have gotten it. The idea of equifinality, which is a term that just means people take different roads to the same endpoint. There's no one way, right? And we see that in the learning trajectories of students, that they're very different. But I was talking before about learning-centered teaching, and I think the fact of the matter is, and this is not everybody agrees with me on this, but I don't see an endpoint to learning. I don't see an endpoint to language. So that's why we have to create learning-centered teaching. People can go beyond. If there's no endpoint, if there's no competence at the other end, then how are we going to assess students? How are we going to see the development if there's nothing to compare them with in terms of the endpoint of the interlanguage continuum or whatever we're using? Well, we have assessment of learning, the kind of summative assessment, and we have assessment for learning, the formative assessment. But what about assessment as learning? How can we use the assessment opportunity to teach, to have students learn? And I try to do that in my own classes, that they learn something from being assessed. And that I use, and then using self-referential assessment, which just means helping to see how far they've come, or let me say it this way, what they're doing now that they couldn't do before. That sort of thing, rather than having a benchmark at the end of the continuum that we compare students to. I think maybe finally I would say something about complexity theory encourages us to embrace the uncertainty, because it is an uncertain world as we see now more than ever, and it doesn't deny that. But it says that's what it is. So we have to learn to be nimble, to be agile, and to embrace the uncertainty. We don't know what's coming ahead. We can't predict. Who would have predicted? Maybe some people would have predicted. I didn't predict what we're experiencing right now. My government didn't. It certainly didn't seem to prepare for it adequately. So, how can we entertain that? How can we live in a world that's not certain? So those are some ideas. I guess that doesn't really answer your question about what do you do on Monday morning, but it isn't a method, right? It is, as I say, a way of thinking.
Yes, it's a way of thinking. And as you were speaking again, because I saw your presentation in Rio, uh,
Oh,
and
yes.
you also talked about
Isla.
iteration. Yeah, Isla, and you also talked about iteration. And as you were talking right now, I about that, about the children wanting their parents to repeat the same story over and over again. I was thinking here that uh, we find comfort in things that are familiar to us in a certain way.
Yes, yes, yes. We do. But I think comfort. I think there's real learning going on there.
Yeah.
Um, and it's not memorizing language. You don't
Mm-hmm.
memorize language, but you join in the process of meaning making. And I think that's what it invites.
Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Uh, so, in order to come up with these questions, I read over, I read again some of your articles, and there is a very good article. I mean, a 2018 article. It's called "Looking Ahead: Future Directions in and Future Research into Second Language Acquisition." And as I wrote here, I can it can be seen as premonitions to what we are experiencing now, because the first you talk about two directions, right? And the first one points to the adoption of an ecological perspective. and I quote now, whereby the relationships among factors are what it's key to elucidating the complexity. And the second direction is related to the importance of context uh, and of the nature of constraints that shape any particular context. So I would like to hear your thoughts on how the ultimate changes in the global context has reorganized so rapidly and intensely our language learning and teaching contexts.
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I'm not the only one that has thought about this or has answers. We all have to think about it. That article was invited by the editor of Foreign on the occasion of their 50th anniversary, and I was asked to look ahead. And those 2 points, as you aptly summarized, Arnaldo, are what I chose to address. The idea of ecology is really important, I think, and that's a complexity dynamic systems perspective, a complex dynamic systems perspective, that we're all part of it. I talked about the interconnectedness. It's an ecological theory. It suggests that context is indeed not separable from the actors or what they're acting upon. But before I get ahead of myself, back to the ecology. Complex dynamic systems theory is also about relations. It's about relational teaching and learning, not just the relationship you have with your students, but the relationship they have, the relationship with material, the relationship with their histories, what they bring, what their previous experiences were, all of that. So just to ground that, the field of, this was written for second language acquisition, right? The field of second language acquisition early on in the 1970s adopted made a decision. Well, it wasn't conscious, but made a decision to bifurcate the field. And some looked at the learning process, and some looked at learners and studied individual differences and the differential success, why it was that certain learners were more successful than others. What were the characteristics of success? And I think the ecological perspective doesn't only invite, it commands us to bring those together, learners and learning, because it is the relationship between those and among all the other factors that's important. It's not a question of isolated learners. As Claire Crumptious said, quoting Keats, how can you tell the dancer from the dance? How can you tell the learner from the learning? We know our students are all individuals, and we want to see how they make sense of language and what we're doing. So the ecological perspective suggests that context is all important. That was the second point. Often we talk, and I've done this myself, in a way, in an abstract way, as I said before, in a decontextualized way, when context makes all the difference. And that's why teachers will say, well, that's a great idea, but that won't work in my context, and so teachers have to be the ultimate arbitrators of what works and what doesn't. But context is all important in an ecological theory. The context of the jungle is very different from the context of the Arctic glacier landscape. But that's very gross, but I'm talking about the context of this time, at this point, as being so important and so formative. The other thing is that the context includes ideologies. We come in with ideologies, with ideas about learning, about teaching, about language, some of which are not very, very helpful. And we need to be aware of that. The ecology suggests not just what happens in the here and now, although that's what I have to attend to as a teacher, but that here and now is informed by a greater context. Certainly within my school, the administration makes a difference, but even outside of the school, the parents of my children, my students, makes a difference if they're young students. But as I say, the ideologies, what are the prevailing ideologies about language learning, and how does that impact what I do, and the attitudes and the affect of my students? So that's a lot of words. Those are, but I think ecology is important, looking at everything, looking at the relationship of the parts, and those parts and everything within a context, both a time context and a space context. Ah, I'll let you make sense out of that, Ronaldo, and anybody else who wants to
No, it makes
wants to.
total sense, especially now.
Yeah, yeah, especially now when the context has changed dramatically.
Yeah,
Yes, and yet the relationship is what's central.
yeah, awesome. And in another wonderful article, this is a 2019 article. It's called "On Language Learner Agency: A Complex Dynamic System Theory Perspective." You start the article with the sentence, "We live in tumultuous times," with capital letters. And in this article, you established connections between agency and complex dynamic systems theory, and also made teaching suggestions. And I quote now, those that optimize language learning by recognizing learner agency, those that seek to enhance learner agency, and those that support learners in deploying their semiotic resources as they wish. So, could you help us think about how can we reorient our teaching practices to support and foster learners' agency?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I've been thinking about that a lot and writing about it and speaking about it. So, well, first of all, as you say, I started out by saying we live in tumultuous times. Boy, don't we now? Uh, so recognizing that is really important. But personally, I have felt disempowered in a way that I hadn't before. I felt like a lot of things are happening in the world that are beyond. Well, it's not my control because I've never been able to control them, but just people's power, people in authority, and making decisions that affect my life that I seem to have very little um, say about. I feel being done unto. So that was the origin of my thinking about this: is how can we make ourselves more agentive, more empowered to make a difference, the capacity to change us and the world. Well, that sounds very grandiose, but we all together can do that. The second thing, and I've been bothered for this for a long time, this is not a new awareness, theories of second language acquisition, ones that I contributed to, by the way, so that's truth, that's a confession, have, I think, underplayed or ignored the agency of learners. This is true in our methods too. I mean, asking people to repeat and repeat and repeat in drills doesn't really leave room for learner agency, right? The teacher's in control, the teacher's orchestrating the class. There's not a lot of room for students to do something other than what they're being commanded to do. No choice there. But our theories too. I mean, if we stop and think about our theories, I came into the field when we were looking for universal developmental sequences. And that was an exciting time. We thought perhaps there was as Pitt Corder called, a built-in syllabus in our heads. And I thought, wow, I just come from Malaysia. I said, wow, I could be so much a better teacher if I could teach in harmony with that universal syllabus that that we all carry with us, rather than contrary to it. And of course, we found out that wasn't the case. That there was no universal syllabus. At least I believe there isn't. But notice that, because even there, with good intent, we said, there's a universal syllabus. You just have to start it, and the learning will take place. There was no agency there for learners. Or comprehensible input. I mean, that's a great notion. You don't want to give people incomprehensible input. But it's usually, at least initially, it was usually put forth as the teacher would create the input that was comprehensible. And then the students would receive it. But what about learners? Don't they have a say in what's comprehensible and what's not? So I think a lot of our well-intentioned theories and methods did not give appropriate agency to learners. we lose a lot from that, not to mention not preparing students to be agentive in this world. And goodness knows the kinds of problems we have to wrestle with beyond pandemic. I mean, global warming, or the migration of hordes of people fleeing war-ravaged countries, or economic difficulties, or impossibilities, or environmental degradation. We have to come together. We have to find some agency, collective agency, to make changes for the betterment of everybody. So you asked me about it, and I tried in that article to talk about ways that we might help foster the agency of our students so they feel empowered to make a difference, and then they can take that empowerment outside of the classroom. And so Bao asks interesting questions. He says, who gets to decide, sorry, I should read my notes. Who gets to remain silent in the classroom? Who gets to ask questions? We teachers can ask those kinds of, which ways do some learners get to remain silent? We can look at our pattern of asking questions and see whether or not they are empowering. We can, rather than asking if students transfer what they have learned to other times, we can ask, what connections are they making for themselves? We can be open to ourselves, because it is a relation. There is a reciprocity there, and in order to foster their agency, I think we need to show that we are changed by the process of engagement with our students, not just that they are, and that's not so easy. The mutual transformation, acknowledging the mutual transformation, not so easy for teachers who are assumed to be the authority, but it's a very human character. If we can actually do something to show that we are affected by their presence as well. And many teachers do this, by the way. I should have said that right from the start. Not trying to suggest that this is all news for teachers. I think a lot of teachers do this, but I've been working on it myself a bit. Agency, I ask my students to bring in a bit of language from the outside that they are curious about, and then we explore it together in the classroom. That's part of learning, learning how to learn. So I guess I'm not expecting. Another example I gave was learner-driven feedback. The teacher gives the feedback, but the learner or students have a choice in how it's delivered. For example, is it online? Is it face-to-face? Is it in paper? With a large class, you can't have individuals all deciding they want feedback in a particular way. But you could say, okay, this week, let's decide to do it one way. Let you decide which way you want it. Next week, we'll do another way, or something like that. The point is to give students more choice and voice in the classroom, with the idea that they have the capacity to optimize their own learning or not. And what we want to do is make this a team effort, right? We want it to be a partnership.
Yes, because nowadays students, they have voice in many places, except the learning spaces. And I think I truly share your thoughts, because we need to
Yeah.
have our students heard their voices inside the classroom also.
Yes. And Ronaldo, I should just add another little caveat here too, which is that teacher agency is really important
Yeah.
too. And teachers feel being done unto. They're made to teach to standardized exams, and they're held responsible for their students' performance on those, when that's not fair, really. Or they have to respond to the edicts of the authorities, either in the ministries of education or right locally within their school or school district. And teachers often feel disempowered. Last year in this country, there were a number of teacher strikes and demonstrations where teachers got together, and sometimes they were asking for greater salary, and they probably deserve it. I'm sure they deserve it. But they were also asking for equipment and proper support for their teaching and libraries, and a lot was cut in education budgets during the 2008 recession and after the aftermath. And so they're asking now, in most cases successfully, for support for their teaching. But it took collective action on the part of the teachers to bring about the changes.
Yeah. Uh, and I mean, now in these times that we're living now, teachers agency. Uh, I think teachers are so, at least my colleagues, they're so overwhelmed with uh, the amount of work that they have uh, to do, that an environment that allows teachers to make their own choices and uh, to be and
Yeah.
to act, you know, in the sense of being, I mean, to be activists. And I think, yeah,
Yes. I mean, our job is not just to enact someone else, right? I mean, our job is to teach and to be have the resources that we need to be able to reach each and every one of our students. And that's a tremendous responsibility. And we can do it much better when all the stakeholders are working together,
yes,
but not in a hierarchical way, the way they usually work.
yeah, in a more horizontal direction. Uh,
Yes.
and I mean, something that you said that really captured my attention is that you are a researcher, but you're also a teacher. And so,
Yes.
before concluding this wonderful uh, interaction, I would like to ask you uh, to give some advice, if you could give some advice to teacher educators, teachers and learners. Which advice would you give concerning our contemporary ways of teaching and learning?
Yeah. Well, remember, it's all contextual, so I'm not going to talk specifically. And I'm not really in the business of giving advice.
Mhm.
As I said before, we all have to sort of make our way through this. I'll tell you what I think works for me,
Mhm.
and perhaps see your question. I'm trying, even in my elderly, I'm trying to be much more open to change because it was much more comforting before when I was sort of in control and the sole source of language was what I brought in or the textbook brought in. That's not true anymore. Students get exposed to language much more than in the classroom. I'm not in control. I want to have agency, but I'm not in control. I have to be much more comfortable with change because that's going to I have to be open to it. That's the nature of it. Um, I have to embrace the uncertainty. Somebody said uncertainty is the new normal. And again, we're living it, aren't we? Um, that's hard for me. That's hard for a teacher. You want to say, I'm going to do this, I'm going to get that result. I'll do my best. It's not Machiavellian. I want to do my best for my students. But the uncertainty of what I have to deal with and what they have to deal with is the prevailing norm, and I need to explain that or accept that. Take care of yourselves. You got to take care of yourselves. As you were saying just a moment ago, Ronaldo, I mean, there are so many demands on teachers now, and they're not going to be able to meet them if they don't take care of themselves as well. And whatever that means, it means taking a break, it means going for a walk, it means doing yoga, it means singing, it means cooking a nice meal if you have access to food. Um, but taking a break is important. Being kind to yourself is in these days. That and there's so many other demands of people at home as well. It's not just in the classroom. At this time, I think the world especially needs the compassionate consciousness that language teachers bring with them. And so I guess I would conclude my advice by saying The world needs you. We need you. It's your compassion, it's your empathy, it's your willingness to reach out and support others while taking care of yourselves that is really important in the world today. Probably always has been, but it seems to be even more important, or its importance is magnified. Thank you.
Yeah, and I mean, this article, I mean, this 2019 article, uh, in which you say that we somehow feel disempowered. And I truly believe that it's our role, especially now, to empower our students, and uh, and that we have a responsibility, and despite the situations, I mean the critical situations and not so good situations that we are all living, we still have our mission to empower our students. And I feel very lucky and honored uh, because of this opportunity. I think it was more than an interview. It was a master class that only you could teach, because it was, I
But
mean,
you made it happen. You made it happen. Your agency made it happen, Ronaldo. This would not have happened if it wasn't for you.
yeah,
And what you just said underscored my point. You didn't need my advice. You already have that
no,
way of being, thinking, and being in the world.
no, I thank you so much. I mean, every time I read your articles, I feel that you're, I mean, I don't know. There are some people that when they write, they connect to their readers very easily. So every time I read your articles, I feel like you're talking to me in a way. So it's very special to me to have this moment with you now, and I'm sure everyone at home had the same and felt the same, uh, and I hope that people can benefit from our interaction here. And luckily, it will be recorded, and people will be able to watch later. So thank you so much, everybody here on the comments. They
Thanks.
are also thanking. Uh, you and your advice and your words. They were very enlightening and encouraging in these tumultuous times.
Thank you. I don't have access to the comments for some reason, so I haven't been able to respond, but I appreciate your summing it up. And as I say, it's always reciprocal. I feel the same way.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So, goodbye,
Thank
everyone.
you.
We see each other on the next interview. Bye bye.
Goodbye.